Talk 1400 KFRU is proud to present the KFRU Heritage Series. It's a one-hour perspective on the events and the people whose lives have contributed to the heritage of Boone County. The KFRU Heritage Series from News Talk 1400 KFRU.
I think you're going to enjoy our Heritage Series show today. We're going to talk to someone that you'll know for several different reasons, and we'll try to cover many of those reasons in our interview with Sabra Toll-Meyer, who is a sculptor. You know her for her work that has wound up in the state's capital down in Jefferson City and also various places around town. And we'll pick her brain about her memories and her work doing that as we go through this morning and this evening's program with her on KFRU. But first of all, welcome. It's nice to see you. How are you?
Good morning, David. Thank you.
You also happen to be the family behind, or at least for a while, that owned the Niedermeyer apartment building in downtown Columbia that has been making the news so much. I think your family may have been involved in owning it longer than any other family.
Yes, I believe so. From 1897 to 1989, almost 100 years. 3 generations.
3 generations of, and the name was Niedermeyer. Tell us about your grandparents, who would have been the first in your family to have owned that building.
My grandfather, Frederick Niedermeyer, came from St. Louis to the university. He received a law degree in the early 1892 or thereabouts, and then he married my grandmother, Sabra, and they had 4 children. And all of them attended the university. And although my grandfather had a law degree, he never practiced law, but he was an entrepreneur and owned land. And he and T.S. Gordon bought the Niedermeyer from, I think, a Mr. Cunningham. And thereafter, they added a wing, or maybe 2, the south wing and the west wing, I believe. And they turned the Cottage Hotel, as it was known, into the Gordon Hotel.
It's interesting. I was reading, and we've got history here, and we'll refer to this, I think, often during our visit today.
Right.
This was put together by, if I remember right,
Frank Whelan.
Frank Whelan, who is an archivist formerly with Ellis Library at the University of Missouri. But when it's talking about your grandfather and him buying this building, it said something about him buying this in one year while he was still, I think he was still in law school.
I think that's correct.
So it's interesting that a law student was, the young entrepreneur F.W. Niedermeyer, the Cottage Hotel in 1897, and it said here that he graduated from the University of Missouri Law School in 1898. He was a busy man then.
He must have been, yes.
How far back do your memories go about this particular building?
Well, back to when I was a young child in the 1930s, I can remember going down there with my father. I have been probably in every apartment. I've been all through the basement, which used to scare me because there was one kind of narrow, dark place that you had to go to. But and I've not been in the attic, but I've been everywhere else.
Was it was a hotel during that time, or was it apartments at that time?
No, it was apartments. I believe if you look in the history, I think it was about 1918 that my grandfather, after having leased it to the university for the domestic science program, it became a girls' school even then briefly, then he turned it into the apartment building, and it's been the Niedermeyer Apartments ever since.
Just as a curiosity, do you remember the rest of the places around there? Because now when you look at the Niedermeyer apartment building, you'll see Harpo's just to the north. You'll see across the street a parking garage. On the west side would be what had been a theater a long time ago.
Yes, the Hall
now it's
Theater.
Panera. So, but what was it like down there? What was that setting like?
Well, my memory is there was a low brick building where Harpo's is now, and where the garage is on to the south, on the east side of Cherry, those were houses, rooming houses. A lot of them were for student boarders. And then on the south side, the brick building there, I don't know what it's called now, but at that time it was called the James Apartment, and my grandfather owned that as well.
Yeah, because if you pay attention, some people, I sometimes am guilty of thinking of those buildings being connected, but they're not. I mean, it's a separate
No,
brick
there's an
building that is
alley
a different
there.
building that's between the two. But yes, both apartments. Do you remember who? Was there any conversation about who the tenants were? What kind of people rented those apartments?
Well, I do remember that a Dr. Johnson taught Spanish in the language department, and she lived in the building for 50 years.
Oh, wow.
She had the apartment on the very south end that would be overlooking the alleyway
Yeah.
and overlooking the James. Yes, I do remember seeing her when I was young. And then Jane Froman, when she first returned to Columbia, had an apartment on the first floor in the south wing.
Wow, the porch is beautiful on that building. I can just imagine times when tenants, after it had been a hotel, either a hotel or an apartment, just using that porch all the time.
Well, I think they did, and I do remember back in the probably 70s and early 80s, our managers, a young couple. In fact, Rita Reed is teaching here back in the J School now. And we're going to meet with Warren Dalton later this week. Rita has a lot of memories. They used to have cookouts in the backyard, and it was just. And they had porch sales on the porch, and then they'd have a picnic supper on the porch.
Porch sale, is that like a garage sale?
Like
or
a
is that something
garage
else?
sale on the porch.
And you talk about how they could have cookouts in the back because it's an L-shaped.
Correct.
So there would
And-
be a sort of a courtyard back there of some sort.
Well, it's pretty good size, actually. I could not give you the dimensions, but there were several trees back there. I don't know if they are still there, but in the summer it was quite pleasant, and they had a lot of fun.
Sabra Toll-Meyer is our guest on the Heritage Show on KFRU. We're talking about her family's memories and her memories and the owners of the Niedermeyer Apartments. It was started. Let's refer to some of this history here because, as you said, it turned out to be, I bet, about the time that your family took it. It was a home ec school. It had another name for it, but it was a home ec school. And I know in this history we referred to a little while ago by Frank Whelan, he says it was kind of this twist. It went from beginning as a girls' school to
Yes.
ending up as a home ec department, which would have been basically a women's school
women
at that
at
point
that
in time.
time.
Men
Yeah.
weren't taking home ec classes at that point in time. But it traces its beginning all the way back to 1833. And I think most people who have been following the story about the Niedermeyer Apartments and what's proposed there now know that Richard Gentry, General Gentry, had 5 daughters, and he wanted to start a school for them. How much history do you have from that point in time?
Well, only what I've read and part of what Frank Whalen has written here in this history. We commissioned him to write this history for us since he was an archivist and later went to the state archives. I don't know where he is now. But in 1833, I believe the school, the Columbia Female Academy, I think it was called, was located in the Presbyterian Church, which at that time was on Walnut. And then 1837, the school was doing well, and they raised enough money to build on the corner there, Lot 100. It had never been built on. My understanding was that this school was the first structure to occupy that corner. If you stand at Harpo's now and look across the street, the first floor from the corner to the door that faces Harpo's on the north side, that's roughly the dimensions of the original building.
Now, is that part of that wall that stood there?
It's the wall. The entire school is encased in the building, but on the northeast corner, both of the walls that you see from the east all the way to the door on the east side and the door on the west side, that roughly gives you the size. I think it was like 25 by 40 or roughly that. And if you step on the porch, you can easily, and the original windows are still there. And if you're standing inside, you can see the crinkles in the glass, the way the old glass was. And you can see the difference in pattern because the old building was built with what's called Flemish bond, which is different from the bricks that are laid end to end. The Flemish bond has one brick laid how would I say this?
I think I know.
Pointing to the outside. So
they
you
would
have
be
two
perpendicular,
longs,
sort of,
one
or make
short.
an L shape. Sometimes, I mean, as you would lay, then
Yeah. There would be two bricks horizontally and one brick that goes vertically back into the wall. So it looks like two longs, one short, and so forth. Anyhow, that is the old Flemish bond. So it's easy to distinguish that portion of the building. You can still see it.
and that was the original part.
That was the original part. Downstairs, underneath that original part, you can walk in, and when last I was there, it was dry as a bone. You can see the pickaxe marks that were used to create this basement. And then on top of that is the stone foundation.
Now, are there apartments in the basement, or was that just a storage area down there?
That was mostly, I don't think there were. My father had an office on the south end in the basement, and at one time there may have later been an apartment, but that was the only one. And there were about 30 or 31 apartments, I think, counting the managers. The school became the manager's apartment.
I see. You know, when the history that you talk about that your family had commissioned, I think I could have afforded that lot if I were buying it in today for the price that they paid then in 1837, February of that year, $175 for that lot.
Yes.
I'm sure that, I mean, obviously that's a lot of money back then, but it doesn't seem like that's very much right now.
It would be interesting to compute that into today's.
It sure would. But that was, so they had the academy. You know, the interesting thing about this history, and you have it as a school there, mentioned as a possible visitor. She did visit Columbia, may have visited the school.
Yes.
Was
Mary
Mrs.
Todd,
Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd.
whose cousin was a student.
Isn't that something?
Well, it is amazing. Yes.
So that would have been in the 1840s. That would have been
Yes.
before Civil War broke out and before Mary Todd became the first lady. But how about that? You think of the names associated with this. A lot of people immediately say, well, Mark Twain spoke there, and we can mention that in just a moment or two. But I had not heard of Abraham Lincoln's wife being there. But it's a possibility that she was, because she had a relative.
She
that
did
went to school
visit
there.
Columbia. I think that part is true, and they are supposing that when she was here, she would have visited her young relative.
The other intrigue about this, as I was reading through this history, is that having an interest in religion myself, it's interesting what religious splits do sometimes.
Yes.
And there was a religious split because, I guess, different beliefs clashed, and sometimes, as the case is, they say, well, we're going to go our way and you can go your way. What do you know about the religious problem?
Well, it must have been pretty difficult there for a while. And, of course, Stevens College, because of that division, traces their beginnings to the Lucy Wales Academy.
Yeah, which was a Baptist college.
Yes.
We're talking
Baptist.
1856 or so, around there.
Yes.
The building went through a period of being vacant. It's a shame because it seems from the history that it was pretty successful and things were going well for it.
Yes.
But then certain things happened, and even a year or so after it had been at its peak, it shows how tough it is to get something to be successful nowadays, or even not much 150, 175 years ago, not much different in it.
That's true.
The Union troops may have used it for a while. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, then it may have become a private residence for a time. And
I like one of the quotes that's in the history. This property is well situated in a good neighborhood and will be sold without reserve for cash in hand. And it was from that first selling was in the 1830s up to 1865. So about 30 years later, it was sold to a Dr. Samuel Victor, who was a pharmacist in Columbia, for the sum of just over $1,400. I could still afford that, I think, on most days. This is interesting because in the history, and you might help me if you can add anything to this, Dr. Samuel B. Victor, an enterprising man who was known as something as a local chanter? Shanter? I mean, he
I
has a great...
I don't know what that means.
It says here, lifelong bachelor. He spent his time selling patent medicine and coming up with rhyming couplets which shocked rather than impressed the ladies. He is worth his own history, isn't he?
Yes, I think maybe there might be a book on him.
He rented it out as a property. According to contemporary accounts, he had several properties around Columbia that he rented out. The 1876 an issue of the Missouri Statesman contains an ad by Victor for some very good houses for rent. It says, who lived in the building during the 1865 to 1895 period when Victor owned it is unknown. But wouldn't that be great to know?
It would.
That was well before your family bought the property. But again, you can think of that late 1800s, right before the turn of the century, when your family came into the picture.
Yes.
We're going to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll visit more. I don't, this is the history of the building, but it still has to be something that brings back a lot of memories when you hear the conversation about it that's going on now, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. We're going to come back and visit more. Our guest is Sabra Tull Meyer. Her family, the Niedermeyers, owned for a long period of time what's known as the Niedermeyer Apartments in downtown Columbia that are so much in the news today. We'll come back after this break with more at the Heritage Show on News Talk 1400 KFRU.
More coming up on News Talk 1400 KFRU. This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
We're talking about the Niedermeyer Apartments in the first segment or two of our visit on the Heritage Show this week with Sabra Tull Meyer. You'll know her also as a sculptor, and we're going to ask her some questions about that also, because she has some great works on display in Jefferson City and around this community. Let's go back to the Niedermeyer Apartments for a moment. Do you know from the time when you were talking about as a young girl and your grandparents owning the building that is in the news now, what were the apartments like? How plush were they compared to what else was in this community?
Well, I would say at that point in time, back in the 30s, there weren't a lot of plush apartments. I think they were mostly small, one bedroom. There was one on the northeast corner on the second floor that I believe had 2 bedrooms, but that was unusual. And they had small kitchens and bathrooms, and there were working class people there, not so many students in those days. Or if my father was leasing, as many landlords today would do, graduate students only for obvious reasons. But I would say it was mostly working class people.
And they did have kitchens, so they would be able to provide their own meals there.
Yeah, they all had kitchens.
It wasn't a boarding house, so these were apartments.
These were apartments.
From the 30s up to when your family last owned it in the late 80s, how tough was it then to find tenants, or how changing was the apartment scene in Columbia?
Well, at that point in time, there still were not a lot of there were rooming houses for students, and as I mentioned, across the street on the east side of Cherry, where on the east side of 10th Street, where the garage is now, there were houses that had been converted into rooming houses. And one of them, down towards the corner, had a small cafe underneath where other people in the neighborhood would come, and you went down about 3 steps into the basement level. I don't remember the name of it. But I think that it was comparable to other apartment buildings.
Was it hard? Did you see challenges of upkeep, or I don't know what it would be like to keep a building that at that point in time, and by the 30s, it was 100 years old, a good portion of that.
Exactly.
I mean, your family also, though, did the additions to it.
Well, my grandfather did. He died in the early 30s, so my memory is of my father doing most of this work. He had workmen to help him, but there were constant problems. I can remember the phone ringing, Mrs. So-and-so in apartment 203, her toilets overflowing, there were just constant it was constant maintenance and upkeep.
I'm trying to think then. There hasn't been any real additions to it then of any
No,
size.
not since 1902. The south wing was added by my grandfather and Mr. Gordon, and it contained a large, almost all of the south wing was a ballroom, and this is where the meeting with Mark Twain and everything took place. But some of the interior walls, to my memory, the west wing, the interior wall that borders the hallway, and there's a long hallway, there are apartments on the south side, apartments on the north side, and that wall in the hallway, to my memory, is like 8 inches thick, solid brick.
Wow.
And some of the other apartments, perhaps when they added on another part to the wing, they may have had an exterior wall, but a lot of the interior walls are solid brick, which, can be good in one sense, but not in another if you are adding. And of course, electrical things that had to be wiring and electricity had to be put into those kind of metal channels that run along the walls.
Occupancy, as far as your history in that, never a problem finding enough renters for it in that time
Not
period?
to my memory. All through the 30s and, of course, in the 40s, the war started. There was no new building. And then after the war, I can still remember my father. The government put a restriction. You could not raise rents. That was the last government regulation, I believe, that stayed in place for a number of years, maybe 4 or 5 years. And my father complained bitterly all the time to all of his friends. I even have a little poem at home that Mr. Neat wrote about there's Frank Tull walking down the street complaining again about not being able to raise the rents. And so I'm sure it was difficult because going through the war, finding supplies, keeping everything running and repaired, and so anyhow.
Again, Sabra Tull-Meyer is our guest on the Heritage Show on KFRU. We're talking about the Niedermeyer Apartments downtown. We mentioned Mary Todd before she was Mrs. Lincoln, the First Lady of this country. She I know she visited Columbia, and she had a cousin who was an academy student at the building that is now the Niedermeyer Apartments. Other names, William Jennings Bryan attended a dinner in the hotel's meeting room. That would have been around 1900.
Yes, and then 1902.
1902. Then it says here, a group of 50-person members of Phi Beta Kappa Society and guests gave a dinner for Mark Twain. Mark Twain was in town.
Wouldn't that have been fun to hear?
Yeah, you know what? I don't think you would have been invited because in one place I saw was
only men. Exactly.
But what a group, because in the history that you have, present at that dinner were Robert S. Brookings, and that name is familiar for the Brookings Institute. One of the first so-called think tanks, Secretary of the Interior Ethan Allen Hitchcock, Secretary of Agriculture James Wilson, Beverly Galloway, Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, all of whom were also to be honored by the university. And Beverly Galloway, somebody would say, well, there was a woman there. No, Beverly was a man's name. A man's name. And President of the university, that would have been President Jesse. Board of Curators, Colonel William Lamb of Virginia, former Confederate commander of Fort Fisher. And it says in the history that Twain's speech, according to one account, kept the audience in a constant state of laughter, which reached at the times the explosive stage. It would have been great to have been there.
Oh, it would have. And the next page, I think, at the top gives a little bit of what he said, doesn't it?
Twain mentioned the curators, saying that he didn't know what it was they cured.
I love that.
And then suggested, after Mr. Galloway made a comment about goats, that goats should be editing half the magazines in the country because after a manuscript of his was rejected by newspapers and magazines, this is a quote attributed to Mark Twain, a goat took it at once and showed himself much wiser than any of the editors. He would have eaten the whole thing. I also like this now, again, your family was owning it at this point in time? No, not owning it.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
right at the early 1900s. I'd already owned it for about 5 years.
Yes, that's right.
The Gordon, as it was called then, and it would have been a hotel,
Yes.
attracted. This would have predated the Tiger Hotel. The Tiger Hotel wasn't
Oh, yes,
built at that
till
point
the
in time.
20s. Uh-huh.
Would have I don't know whether the hotel, which is on Broadway, which the city offices are in now. That used to be a hotel also.
The Daniel Boone.
Yeah, the Daniel Boone Hotel. That wouldn't have been around then, would it? Also, or would it have been
I
about
don't
that
think
time?
it was built until the 20s.
The Gordon attracted a large crowd for its food alone. I like that part of this history also. A former university professor, Witherton C. Curtis, who used to take his meals there, described a typical day's fare as buckwheat cakes for breakfast and country ham or chicken for lunch or supper. And on Sunday, a turkey dinner was served. It was Mrs. Gordon, whose father had been the first warden of the Missouri Penitentiary of Jefferson City. That was, quote, the spark plug there. She knew what good cooking was and was able to keep the best help at that time.
Yes.
At that point in time, it would have been black persons who had helped out there as the serve staff at that point in time. How about that? It's just hard to picture how vibrant that corner had to have been.
Yes, that's right.
Did your grandparents talk much about this in their latter years as they were thinking about what they had been a part of?
Well, my grandmother died. My grandmother, Niedermeyer, died before I was born, and my grandfather died in the early 30s. I was probably 7. So my memory is of my father and mother talking about it.
When you say that you have walked through that building, when was the last time that you spent?
The last time I was there was probably just before Mr. Henshaw purchased the building.
Late 80s.
Right.
Did you have a feel
89?
for it? Was there?
Oh, yes.
What's it like? You're an artist also, so do you look at it? You might see it differently than the rest of us.
I love the architecture. I believe at one time someone referred to it as Queen Anne. Now, I'm not an architecture student, but it's just a pleasing building. Of course, it was red brick, and I was trying to rack my brain to think when it was painted. But I remember a discussion about the brick being soft, and the mortar was crumbling, and I'm just not sure if that was when my father was talking about it. So they decided to paint it as a way of preserving the brick and the mortar. That was one suggestion. So it has been painted and has been white for a very long time.
Are there pictures? Does your family did it take? I don't know whether they took pictures of the building.
Well, we have a lot of photographs that are from various publications. The Commercial Club, which my grandfather was a member of, that was in the early 1900s, and there's a small book. There are 2 or 3 other books, and Cindy Mustard, I think, has collected some of them, and they all show a photograph of the Niedermeyer as being one of the prominent locations in town.
How close did your parents live to that when they were did they hire managers to manage that apartment?
Yes, there was a manager always who took the rent and lived. As I said, the school became the manager's apartment.
On the
and
corner
you can go inside now, and you can, as I said, see the windows. There's a fireplace in the middle, one room on the northeast corner, one room behind it, and a smaller room behind that served as the kitchen and bathroom.
So what was your home area? What was the area that you
Let's see.
ran when you were a young person in Columbia?
Well, we lived in the East Campus neighborhood when I was very young on the corner of Williams and Wilson. And then we moved because grandfather owned the buildings that were on Hitt Street from Paquin to University Avenue. And what they called the home place was a big white building with a wraparound porch, typical 1900s. And then behind that, along Hitt Street, there was the Sampson apartment. There was the old Sigma Nu house, which my grandfather had built for the Sigma Nus before they went to College Avenue. And then there was another duplex next to that. So we lived at 408 Hitt Street for quite a long time in the duplex. And then about the time I was in high school, we moved to the, quote, home place and lived there. And
so near the campus, isn't it?
Well, and when my brother and I were growing up, we could it was much safer then. Children could go out and play in the neighborhood, and we knew every building on the white campus.
I bet you
and
did.
one year, I was probably about 10 or 12, on Memorial Day, I don't know if they still do it, but in the tower on Memorial Day, that was the one day of the year, they opened that door, and you could climb up to the second and the third floor and read all the names inscribed of people who were killed.
You're talking to Memorial Union.
Exactly. And of course, there were no buildings on either side. It was just the tower. And I can just remember being so thrilled and running home to tell my parents that we were able to go up on the second floor. I think we even went up to the third floor. But it was so beautiful. And
I've never heard of that, so I don't know whether they still do that
and
or not
I have
now.
no idea either. But that was a tradition. And then, there was the biology building, and you could go in there and see all the stuffed animals. And so it was, Columbia was just a different place at that point in time.
Did you go to Hickman High School?
I did. I went to the lab school first from kindergarten through junior high. Then I went to Jefferson Junior and then graduated from Hickman. And I have 4 or 5 friends, all of whom are still living. And we started out in kindergarten and graduated from the University of Missouri.
Oh, my goodness.
One lives in St. Louis, one lives in Ohio. 2 are in St. Louis, in fact. So,
Do you have any favorite places that you used to go hang out when you were in high school?
let's see, we used to stop. We all walked. I think there might have been a bus system maybe after the war, but we all walked to school, and we used to stop by Garrett's grocery store, which was on the north side of Jefferson Junior. It was there forever, and it was a big hangout. And then sometimes downtown, trying to think of the name of the drugstore that was on the north side of Broadway, about where the Exchange National Bank is. There are shops in there now. But the drugstore was also a big hangout. You'd go and have a Coke.
Wow. Town has changed, hasn't it?
A whole lot. I imagine, when I was young, West Broadway, let's see, you could ride out West Broadway, and West Boulevard was the west end of town, and Highway 63 was the east end of town. And we could ride our bikes and go all the way out West Broadway, and it was nothing except for, what was that? The inn and restaurant. The house is still there on the south side of Broadway before you get to West Boulevard. Anyhow, Springdale. And during the 30s, Springdale was quite a place for the students to hang out. It was a great place to go and eat and have a libation, I suppose.
So that building's still there? Is it
Yes, it is a home.
right before you get to where? West Boulevard?
West Boulevard.
On Broadway?
You
on the
pass
south or north
the
side of
NH.
Broadway?
It's on the south side.
Yeah.
And you go down the hill after you pass the NH, and just as you rise, on your left, you'll see this white house.
Okay.
Now, Broadway was not so wide then, so at one time it had a
I can picture that.
front.
We're going to take our final break, and we'll come back and we'll continue our conversation with Sabra Tull-Meyer. You're listening to News Talk 1400 KFRU.
More coming up on News Talk 1400 KFRU. This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
Our final segment today on the Heritage Show on KFRU with Sabra Tull-Meyer, and we've talked a lot about the Niedermeyer Apartments. Her family owned that. Refresh my memory again. You said from
1897
all the way to
1989.
So just shy of a century.
Mm-hmm.
And you pointed out to me as we were in break that it will soon. They could count in another 20 years. It'll be 200 years that existed. Now, out in the Northeast, there are a lot of places out on the East Coast that are 200 years plus old, but there are not very many around this part of the world that are 200 years old. Any other thoughts that you have that you want to share about it?
Well, I am in a way sort of surprised at all of the interest in it. I really thought I might be probably one of the very few who would mourn its demise, but And I understand all of the complications. I understand Mr. Henshaw's right to sell his property. I just wish that there could be some kind of effort made. I'm sure they're trying, and so we'll just have to see.
Yeah, time will tell what will be the future of the Niedermeyer Apartments, or that corner, which was an empty lot in 1830 or around 1830 when somebody paid $175 and said, let's build a female academy there, or a girls' school. Let's go on to the other work that you're well known for, and that is your sculpturing. How many public displays of your artwork are there right now in Columbia, would you?
Well, let's see. I have about 6 on the University of Missouri campus. I have one at the courthouse, Roger Wilson. I have on the Katy Trail, Don Patterson's memorial relief. I have Audrey Walton's plaque relief portrait at the soccer...
Audrey J. Walton Soccer and Track and Field Facility.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep. You didn't happen to do Tom Botts there, too, did you?
No, I did not, but that's a wonderful sculpture of Tom Botts.
When did you start? Was this something that you did from early on with your...
I always loved drawing, and I majored in art back in the dark ages in my days at the university, and there was sculpture was not offered. They had drawing, painting, design, history of art, and so forth. After we moved back to Columbia in about 1967, 1975, my youngest of my 4 children was able to drive, and so I went back to graduate school. And Don Bartlett was the sculptor instructor then, and he was a wonderful man. And so even then, I guess I was probably 49, so perhaps there's a message there. Wow. Anything is possible.
Yeah, so it was 49 when you really started.
I was 49, yes. And
wow.
I know, David.
No, I mean, I'm thinking about that's how much you've accomplished in a relatively short amount of time, and to not have started that, I mean, that's very unusual.
Well, perhaps it is, but in the day when I was raising my children, our children, I guess I was part of what they call now stay-at-home mom. Mm-hmm. Then it was the normal thing to do. But in any case, I think the thing that worried me most of all, was how the other students would react to me. I need not have worried about that. There were other things I might have worried about, but not that. They were very accepting and frequently would say things like, gee, I wish my mom would do something like that. So that was a relief. So in any case, I think I cast my first bronze probably in 76 or 78.
Who was that of?
And it was of George Caleb Bingham. I have done 2 busts of Bingham, a second one for the Hall of Fame and another copy of the Hall of Fame for the University Fine Arts Building. But this first one was rather large and probably monumental in size. And it came time to cast it, and the crucible at the university held 90 pounds of bronze. And by weighing the wax, 10 pounds for every pound of wax, then you know how heavy your bronze is going to be.
I see.
So there was a lot of discussion. Would I cut it in half? Would I split it front to back? And a man named Jim Fraze, who was an instructor at that time, who's going to have a retrospective at the Boone County Historical Society soon, he walked in and he said, that's easy. You make a Roman joint, you cut the neck out, and you cast the lower half, collar, shoulders, and tie, and then you cast the head, which I did. You put the head down inside the collar, and it's welded, and there you had it. So
you're able to get it in and get it taken care of.
So that's why I remember that.
You told me before we started our program today, you have 10 busts in the Hall of Fame, the Missouri Hall of Fame.
Yes, I do.
Just a quick mention of, you can't go into stories about all of them, but what are they? Which ones are they?
Well, let's see. I have John Ashcroft, Bob Barker, George Caleb Bingham, and this is a new bust of Bingham, Dale Carnegie, General Alexander Donovan. The only women that I did, there are some others, is Sister Rose Philippine Duchesne, who was famous for establishing the first free school for Indians and children who could not afford to be educated privately. And it's in St. Charles. You can still see the schoolroom there. She was a very remarkable woman, came to America when she was nearly 50. Also traveled out west once she had established this school. She went to Colorado and came back. To read her life story is just fascinating. Then I think the first bust I did was Hubble, for whom the Hubble telescope is named.
Yep.
And then I did Lamar Hunt of the Chiefs fame, and James McDonald of McDonald Aircraft. That was one of the last. And Marlon Perkins, famous for the Wild Kingdom.
Wild Kingdom.
Yes.
Wow. And you like to read about these people. You know them.
In
addition to what they look like, you study them.
Yes. I always like to know as much as possible about the subject. Even though I have photographs to look at, it still gives you some kind of insight into their personality.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to do another one of these programs just about your sculpture work, and you can tell us about the famous Missourians that you've learned about. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to visit with us on our program. And we still have the history of the Niedermeyer apartments. I think it's a terrific history. And as you said, time will tell what happens on that corner downtown.
That's right.
But at least we got some memories that we've shared today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Sabra Tull-Meyer, our guest. Thanks for listening. You can hear the Heritage program on Sundays at 7 and 7 on News Talk 1400 KFRU.
You've been listening to the KFRU Heritage Series, celebrating our history and heritage of Columbia and Boone County. Listen each Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The KFRU Heritage Series. News Talk 1400 KFRU.